Welcome to a LeaderFactor Live. Tim and I decided to spend just a few minutes today and talk through a couple of our new additions in terms of content, some announcements for things that will be upcoming, and just take a few minutes to say hello and to connect with you all. So Tim, thank you for taking a few minutes to talk to us today.
Yeah, good to be with you, Junior. Thank you.
Absolutely. So a couple announcements that we wanted to start out with. Many of you have probably connected with us via webinars in the past. We've run those monthly for probably the last, how many, Tim? How many have we done?
We've done 21 in a row.
We've done 21 in a row. That's a pretty good streak.
I guess that's 21 months.
That's a pretty good streak. So almost 2 years straight that we've been running those monthly webinars. And the participation has been absolutely fantastic. And so we wanted to let you know out the gate today in this live that those will be starting back up again in Q1 of next year. I think it probably is appropriate to help you understand a little bit why. If we've had such good engagement, why are we taking a little bit of a break? We have been inundated over the last 21 months, apparently.
We have good reasons, Junior. We have good reasons.
We do. I think it's pretty defensible. We have been cranking, burning the midnight oil, burning the candle at both ends, whatever saying you want to use. But we've been doing all of those things to try and keep pace and try and continue to provide the community with value. And so we're taking a little bit of a break on the webinar side, certainly not taking a break internally with the other stuff that we have going on. But we're just doubling down and focusing on a few of the technology components that are under construction, some architecture in the new platform, and some new assets for you, one of which we're going to be talking about today, which is the What is Psychological Safety ebook. Our team has put a lot of time and effort into that ebook, and we're going to share that with you today. So really, as just a short agenda, we're going to keep this conversation fairly casual. But we're going to be talking about the ebook. We're going to run through that, highlight a few pieces that we think are particularly important. We're going to talk about a new piece of content that Tim has been really thinking about and crafting over the last while called the Ladder of Vulnerability. We've talked about this concept in the past. We've mentioned it in webinars, talked about it in certifications, but we want to unpack that a little bit. We've got a graphic for you to go along with that. And so we'll talk about that today. And then we've got some upcoming articles that we want to give you a heads up about and ask you a couple questions. So
yeah, a couple articles that maybe we can talk about that I think are going to be exciting. Yeah. And then a little bit of research that we can talk about as well.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and share. I want to go into this and talk a little bit about the ebook, What is Psychological Safety? A quick shout out to our design team. They just keep knocking these out of the park. Yeah. So we appreciate that very much.
It's a beautiful asset, and it's unlike anything that is available today. And I'm just thrilled with the design, Junior.
Yeah, me too. So you can find this. It's available for free on our website. If you go to LeaderFactor.com, hover over psychological safety, there's a drop down that says, what is psychological safety? You can go and download it there. So absolutely free. Go and check it out. And it's probably a little bit more comprehensive than we initially thought it might be, huh, Tim? We really tried to put some meat into this asset.
It's very beefy. It's very thorough. It goes through the history of the concept. And there you go, Junior. Well, why don't you run through that a little bit? Maybe what's in it?
Yeah. So what is in this? It's about 30 pages long. We go into an introduction to the concept, history. I won't read all of these for you, but toward the end, we go stage by stage. So the last third of the ebook goes stage by stage. So if you have engaged with us before in a webinar or some other setting, this is a great way to kind of get your feet wet in what is psychological safety. That's the purpose of this asset, to answer that question. There are a lot of definitions out there. A lot of different ideas and perceptions floating around about what psychological safety is. And so at LeaderFactor, we have a very strong opinion about what psychological safety is and really wanted to put a stake in the ground. And so we've done that with the book, of course, but wanted to create a free asset that you can share, that you can use in order to explain what psychological safety is. So if you haven't read the book and you're interested in the book, you can go ahead and read this if you think you might want to do that. And then I think that this is a nice like intermediary resource between our webinars and a lot of our free content, and then some of our paid solutions like the book, the online course, the certification, etc. So there are a couple things that I wanted to talk about in the introduction that I think are particularly useful. And just to set the stage, this first paragraph I really like. Psychological safety is at the heart of the human experience, okay? Psychological safety is at the heart of your human experience. I want you to reflect a little bit on that. Don't think of it as a theoretical or academic concept or as something that lives only at work. It affects your life, arguably every aspect of it, each and every day. The reason I wanted to call this out and read this paragraph is because this is how we look at psychological safety. This is not just an academic or a theoretical or an at-work type concept. This has everything to do with how we interact with each other as humans. And psychological safety exists everywhere. There's not a pocket of any social collective in which psychological safety is not a thing. It just is a range. It's on a spectrum. It's either high all the way down to very low. And we've probably all been a part of environments that are high, low, and somewhere in the middle. So think of psychological safety that way. It has everything to do with how you interact with other people. So I thought that that was an interesting way to frame it.
It is. And I think we have to acknowledge, Junior, that psychological safety affects you. It influences you. It has an impact on you when in any social unit, in any social situation. But you also have an influence on it.
Yeah.
And so there's reciprocal influence. You influence the level of psychological safety in a social setting, and that overall level of influences you, and you perceive that. And this is going on all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So here we have 4 questions, okay? And these 4 questions are very penetrating, and we thought long and hard about what these questions should be. So these are things that you should ask yourself. First, do you truly believe that all people are created equal? And do you accept others and welcome them into your society simply because they possess flesh and blood, even if their values differ from your own? So that's an interesting, penetrating question. Second, without bias or discrimination, do you encourage others to learn and grow? And do you support them in that process, even when they lack confidence or make mistakes? Third,
because they will, right?
Because they will.
You will, I will, we all will. We're going to, that's going to be the situation sometimes.
Yeah. And Deborah, thank you for your comment. If any of you have comments, go ahead and throw them in the chat. Do you grant others maximum autonomy to contribute in their own way as they demonstrate their ability to deliver results? I really like that question. And fourth, do you consistently invite others to challenge how things are done in order to make things better? And are you personally prepared to be wrong based on the humility and learning mindset you have developed? So why am I going through these questions? Because we can only affect what we can affect. Let me unpack that. We are only in charge of ourselves at the end of the day. We're in charge of our own behavior. And a tendency that I've seen in the category of psychological safety is to point at things and say, that's low psychological safety. That group's low. I'm treated this way. It's a poor environment. But let us take a little bit of ownership, right, for the level of psychological safety that exists around us, because we affect that every single day at home, at work, in any social collective. And so we have to approach this topic with this aura of humility, this aura of introspection. It's very important that we do that. And so that's how we've started this off.
Yeah, Junior, I just want to make a quick distinction here. When it comes to human interaction, we control ourselves. We have the ability to control ourselves, and we should. But we don't control others, we influence others. So there's a very important distinction. We control ourselves. That's the regulatory function that every individual has. And we influence others. That distinction is very important. And if we do that correctly and consistently, then we create high levels of psychological safety.
Absolutely. So what is the vision? Our vision is so there are a couple things that I want to mention here. The first is the definition, and this is probably the most important part. So this entire ebook, this entire concept can be summarized in just one sentence. What is psychological safety? Psychological safety is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. That is what it is. That is the stake that we have put in the ground and said, this is the mechanism by which psychological safety increases and decreases, by which it's governed and managed. If vulnerability is rewarded, we have high psychological safety. If it's punished, we have low psychological safety. So I'd encourage you to read through this part to understand that at an even deeper level. One of the things that we have seen as two common goals across teams and organizations, we have conversations with teams and organizations all over the world, all day long, and across industry, really any type of organization you can think of, we talk to regularly. And they really center around these two things. They want to create sanctuaries of inclusion and incubators of innovation. So those are really the goals that we're looking at. I'm not going to go through all of this. We talk about the history and this holistic idea of what safety is. This is very interesting. We've talked about physical safety and have made great strides in that area for a long time. But the area of psychological safety and this other category of risk is relatively new, huh, Tim?
Yeah, it is. And it's worth the read, right? Because we've added this fifth hazard category that we call psychosocial hazards. And so take the opportunity to read through that. It's worth the read.
Yep. So here are a couple other things. What psychological safety isn't. That is not a conversation that you'll see very often in the realm of psychological safety. People are trying to explain what it is. It's very important that we look at it and talk about what it isn't. So we talk a little bit about some of the costs and benefits of psychological safety. We introduced the 4 stages model. So if you haven't had a chance to become familiar with the model, this is a great introductory resource. And the 4 stages of psychological safety is just that. There are 4 stages. They are sequential, starting with inclusion safety, then moving into learning, contribution, and finally challenger safety. So you're not going to get a comprehensive view of the model in the ebook. It'll be a good introductory resource, but if you want to unpack that even deeper, highly suggest the book. So then the rest of the ebook is made up of stage by stage. So we ask these questions at the beginning of each stage. Inclusion safety, do I feel included? Learner safety, am I growing? Contributor safety, am I making a difference? And finally, challenger safety, am I challenging the status quo? Each of these sections comes along with the definitions of each of these, along with the social exchange. So if you are interested in the actual application and the behavioral elements of some of these things, this is a great place to start. The rest of the last little piece of this is all the resources. So if you want to learn more about psychological safety through the book, the online course, certification, we've really tuned up the certification, and that's been really fun to introduce those last 3 sessions. So we've got 3 sessions left for the end of the year. If you've been thinking about doing the certification, now is probably the best time to sign up. Those are the only 3 remaining sessions that we'll be doing this year. And then, of course, the 4 stages team survey, which many of you are familiar with, and the enterprise solution. So go ahead and download the ebook. Again, that's at LeaderFactor.com. And you can go into the psychological safety header and find this asset. So there are a couple other things that I want to talk about today. And Tim, do you want to give us a little insight into some of the upcoming articles and topics that are top of mind for you?
Oh yeah, we've got a couple of articles that are going to be coming out that I think you're going to be pretty excited about. So the first one is called "Why Agile Transformations Die Without Psychological Safety." And, we touched on some of this in a webinar, but we're taking it a step further. We've been doing more research. We've been talking and interviewing more Agile experts to understand this. And it's really true. So all of the studies show that about half of the Agile transformation initiatives fail across the board, across industry lines, across sectors. About half fail. The primary reason they fail is based on leadership and culture. And it goes right back to psychological safety. Psychological safety is the enabling condition that allows you to do Agile and to be Agile. And so, for example, you can sprint and Scrum and Kanban and Kaizen all day, but if you don't have the underlying condition of psychological safety, you can't truly do and be Agile, right? You're going to be Agile in name only. And that's what we're talking about. So the tools and the processes will not save you. You need the underlying psychological safety that animates the entire process, allows you to use the tools and the processes that are very important for Agile transformation.
We ran a webinar on this just last month, and if you haven't had a chance to check that out, we really do unpack Agile and its relationship to psychological safety. So you can find that on our YouTube channel as well as LinkedIn, and there should be a recording of that live available too. And Tim, there was another one, right?
Yeah, one more article that I think you'll be pretty excited about, and tentatively we're calling this one "Why Some Leaders Are Afraid of Psychological Safety." Now think about that. Not everyone's excited about psychological safety. Most people are, but some people are not. Why would people feel threatened? Why would leaders feel threatened? Well, think about it for a minute. Psychological safety in an organization is a leveling device. It's an equalizer. It doesn't necessarily redistribute the decision-making authority in an organization, but it does empower people in the process of influencing and discussing and collaborating and participating. Some leaders, they take that as a threat. They don't like that because they're entrenched in the status quo. The status quo rewards them. They don't want any redistribution of influence or power. And so you can see they get a little bit nervous because they think, well, this is going to erode my positional power. And that can be true. So I think we have to acknowledge, again, that psychological safety, it is a leveling device. It does equalize and democratize, not power, not decision-making authority, but the opportunity to participate in the process of analysis and influence, right? Which is what we need in organizations. We need that to happen. But we just want to identify that some people, depending on their position, depending on their competency as well, they may feel a little threatened. They may feel a little nervous about, oh, we're going to try to elevate psychological safety throughout the organization. Well, hang on a second. You can see why they get nervous.
You certainly can. Yeah. So those are two articles that I'm really excited about. I had the opportunity to look through a couple of drafts earlier this week, and I think that those are going to be fantastic. So keep an eye out for those. The next thing that we want to talk about is this ladder of vulnerability. So we've gone ahead and created this asset. Again, thank you to the design team for putting this together for us. So a ladder of vulnerability, we define psychological safety as an environment of rewarded vulnerability. Tim, you want to help us understand what vulnerability is?
Vulnerability, well, let's just define it in very simple terms. Vulnerability means that you have exposure to the potential of loss or failure, right? And whenever you're interacting with other human beings, this is always true. But what we have found is that all acts of vulnerability are not created equal. Let's talk about that, Junior, a little bit. So for example, let's say that you come into a social setting, a group of individuals, a team, whatever the setting may be. Your first act of vulnerability is to show up. Right now, if you're face to face, then it's physically being present. That is an act of vulnerability. Yeah. If it's in a virtual setting, what is it, Junior?
It's even turning your camera on, right? Like that's something that we were all met with very early in this whole thing, this whole context that we're still in. And I find that really interesting. I feel like in general, we've become a little bit more comfortable, but certainly like I'm inviting you into my space, right? Yeah. Like this is me. Like I'm in my office at home. And I think that that's a really interesting thing. So sometimes I make the joke every once in a while I'll be on a call and there will be some crying in the background. I've got 2 little girls at home. I'm like, oh, that's my secretary. She's probably just a little bit upset. And it's things like that that have introduced a little bit of vulnerability where in the past that was probably a no-no and maybe definitely a no-no, but something that we can't get away from if we truly want to be authentic and show up in the best way possible. So that's something that I personally have had to learn throughout the last who knows, 18 months. So
Right.
the next thing that I want to acknowledge in the inclusion safety part of things, and that's what we are talking about, that first rung on the ladder, if you will, is inclusion and just showing up. People often jump to really heroic behaviors when we ask the question, what are some acts of vulnerability, right? Let's just list some out. And they'll immediately jump to something like, well, challenging my CEO in public. I'm like, yes,
Right.
that's a big one, right?
Yeah.
That's a little risky.
You just went up to the top of the
Yeah,
ladder.
you just went up to the top.
Yeah.
But acknowledging that there's vulnerability that lies in some of these small acts is very important. So showing up, right? There's vulnerability in me introducing myself and just saying, hi, everybody, I'm Junior, right? Nice to meet you. Shake somebody's hand and say, yeah, how you doing? Where are you from? Those types of things are really interesting. And if you think back to some of your most recent social interactions where you met someone new, think about how that went. When you said, hi, my name is, or hey, how are you? The response dictated the rest of your behavior for the rest of that interaction, right? If they just brushed you off coldly, like, oh yeah, whatever, that doesn't leave just a mark that goes away in 5 seconds with you, right?
No, what did they do? They punished that act of vulnerability.
Yeah, and how likely are you to engage in that same act again, right? How likely are you to engage that same person again and ask them how their weekend was? So out the gate, those relationships can be shut down, which is a tragedy because a very simple act of vulnerability was shut down and was punished. So that's inclusion. So anything that has to do with a feeling of belonging, a sense of inclusion, that's going to fit right in there into stage 1 inclusion. Now let's move into the second rung of the ladder. So you see that icon there. You've probably seen it on a lot of our material. That's representative of stage 2, learner safety. And I want to toggle over to this. I think it's helpful just in terms of context to look at the model for a second. The way that these stages work is as functions of 2 variables, respect and permission. As those increase, we move through the stages. And there are some failure patterns, some things that we're probably not going to unpack today, but it's interesting to look at it this way and then look at the ladder, okay? You can kind of see the ladder in the model itself, and this is just another way to portray that. But we really do talk about these stages as a ladder of vulnerability. So in the learner safety category, now we're talking about, do I feel safe to learn? And what comes along with that? Asking questions, right? Admitting a mistake, saying, I don't know. Those are the types of behaviors that we're talking about when we're talking about learner safety.
Yeah. So those are acts of vulnerability on the second rung. And so let's go back to the premise. All acts of vulnerability are not created equal. There's a ladder of vulnerability. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same for every single person, right?
Yep.
But there will be this progression of increasing vulnerability as you move through the stages for almost everybody. And this is part of the way that we were able to discover the empirical pattern of the 4 stages of psychological safety, because we looked around and you can see that, wow, all acts of vulnerability are not created equal. So is there a pattern here?
Yeah.
It's not arbitrary. So if it's not arbitrary, there's got to be a pattern here. Lo and behold, there's a pattern. So as Junior said, this is stage 2, learner safety. So we're talking about all of the acts of vulnerability associated with learning, associated with discovery, associated with personal development. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
When was the last time you were about to ask a question? You really wanted to ask a question, and then you said, maybe not.
Yeah.
And you put your hand down.
We've happens all the time.
Why did you put your hand down? You put your hand down because you, in your mind, you said, if I ask that question, that act of vulnerability will not be rewarded. It will be punished. I think it's going to be punished. Therefore, I'm not going to do it. So you can see that you're perceiving the level of psychological safety in the social setting, and That perception is governing your behavior. It does that in every stage, right? We ask the question, am I in a safe environment or an unsafe environment? The answer to that question governs our behavior, and it influences us to commit or not commit certain acts of vulnerability in every single stage.
Yep. If you are all liking the stream so far, go ahead and put a like on the stream. We want to make sure to get this out to as many people in our audience as possible. And if we do have time today, we're going to do a little bit of Q&A at the end. I'm not sure that we'll have time, but if you do have questions or a topic that you'd like to discuss, go ahead and throw that in the chat as a comment, and we'll try to address that. So let's go into the third phase, or the third stage. We've got contributor safety. So this is the area of contribution. Respect is high enough and permission is high enough. The organization has allowed us to move into this stage where now we can be on the field, we can contribute to whatever our objective is, and we are in the game. So acts of vulnerability in contributor safety are a little bit different. Can I make a meaningful difference? This is the question that we're asking ourselves in stage 3. So this can be attending a meeting and putting a comment forward. This can be putting a deliverable out on the table for review. This can look like a whole host of things. But start to realize that we're increasing in risk, right? Is it riskier for me to put a deliverable on the table to be scrutinized by my team? More risky to do that than to introduce myself? Certainly. The downside risk is, I guess, at the poll, my job, right? Maybe people don't like what I've done. Maybe I made a big mistake. Maybe it's not up to snuff. Yeah. And so that's the area of stage 3 contribution. And there are many acts of behaviors that fall into that stage.
So let's just kind of summarize that. So contributor safety is about putting your contribution out there, and it gets evaluated. It gets judged, and that's not wrong. That's appropriate, because in stage 3, we're all accountable. We are all asked to make a contribution. We're all asked to contribute to the value creation process, and we're subject to scrutiny. We're subject to evaluation. And so contributor safety is not a human right. You have to earn that through your competence, through delivering results consistently. But I mean, as Junior said, think about the vulnerability that's associated with that. It goes up and up and up because you're putting it out there for everyone to evaluate, and that's not easy to do.
No. And finally, we arrive at stage 4, challenger safety. And this one is the riskiest of all. And just anecdotally, to let you all know, the 4 Stages team survey has borne this out again and again and again as we've looked at aggregate data across the thousands of teams that have responded at this point. And typically you'll see a descending pattern in scores. So one of the reports that we have inside the 4 Stages team survey is results by stage. So it will show your score for the intact team by stage. And very often we see this descending pattern where the scores decrease as we move up the ladder of vulnerability or through the stages. And this is especially true with challenger safety. In almost every case that I've ever seen, challenger safety will be the lowest scoring stage because it's the most risky. There's a tremendous amount of vulnerability in stage 4 when we're challenging. And that challenging can show up a whole bunch of different ways. It could be challenging the direction of the organization in its entirety. It could say, oh, this line of business, this needs to be changed, this process. There are a lot of different ways. It could be even asking a really penetrating question in a challenging way. That's something that could show up in stage 4.
So you can see, it's probably pretty intuitive to most people. You can see how the acts of vulnerability that are associated with stage 4, challenger safety, as Junior said, for most people, they have the most risk.
Yeah.
You personally are at this point of maximum exposure, maximum vulnerability, maximum risk. And so you can see that this is the highest rung on that ladder of vulnerability. And therefore, empirically, as we measure it, this is where teams typically have their lowest scores. Yep. And this is where teams have a lot of opportunity to get better and do better. Because one of the things that that we say is that stage 4 challenger safety is the realm of innovation. Mm-hmm. This is where we innovate. Mm-hmm. Because think about what innovation requires. Innovation requires that we disrupt, that we undermine, that we break, that we violate the status quo. That's the nature of innovation. Well, how are you going to innovate if no one wants to commit an act of vulnerability to challenge the status quo? How can you innovate? You can't innovate very well. So how are you going to create this incubator of innovation that we need so desperately in organizations if you don't have the conditions that will foster, that will cultivate those kinds of acts of vulnerability? People are going to withdraw. They're going to retreat. They're going to recoil, and they're going to say, no, I'm not going to engage in that act of vulnerability. I'm not going to challenge the status quo. It's too risky, right? The risk of retaliation, the risk of retribution, the risk of putting my career on the line, my reputation, I can't do it, so I'm going to play it safe. Okay, but who loses? Who loses when the stage 4 challenger safety is not there? The individual loses because that individual cannot perform at capacity, cannot make a maximum contribution, and the organization loses.
Yep.
The organization loses the creative output of all of these members of the organization. And right. So think about the loss. It's incredible.
Yeah, I really like this comment from YouTube. How do you innovate if no one will communicate? You can't. And it's this idea that innovation is a social process. Innovation doesn't happen alone in a dark room every time, like maybe 1 out of 100. But innovation almost every time happens as a function of social interaction. People that are talking, people that are interacting, ideas that are going back and forth, high intellectual friction. That is the way that innovation works. And so that's why we've included it in this model as the innovation threshold. So thank you for talking to us about this and the comments that we've had so far. I think that this is a very interesting way to look at psychological safety. Tim made a post on this on LinkedIn. And so if you have any additional thoughts, go ahead and engage with that post on LinkedIn. Tim shouldn't be too hard to find, but if you search him, you'll find the post. There's a lot of good engagement going on in that post, and we would encourage you to contribute there. Okay, so just a couple last things that we want to do. The first thing, as part of my last 2 or 3, is going to be to recognize one of our certified trainers and coaches that went through the certification recently, Guillermina, and just want to share some of her feedback of the certification and acknowledge her contribution to the session. So here's what she had to say about the certification. LeaderFactor has extracted the science to develop a very objective framework out of a typically subjective process. I loved the operationalization and measurement of the behavioral elements, the exchange of experiences, and the interactivity of the certification session. I'm very excited about applying it and sharing all I learned. But even more importantly, I'm looking forward to being a change agent and a champion for creating environments which are deeply inclusive, demonstrate growth mindset, provide valuable contributions to the business, and always challenge the status quo. A big thanks for Dr. Timothy Clark and the LeaderFactor team for providing us with robust resources to do so in a sea of superficial chatter. So Guillermina, thank you so much for your kind words. We really appreciate that. Part of the reason I wanted to call that out is to help everyone understand and reiterate the LeaderFactor mission, which is to influence the world for good at scale. And part of the mission of our organization involves all of you, those that are interacting with this live stream, those who engage with the book and our webinar, certifications, all the things that we do. One of the really cool patterns that I've observed over the years with this community is that you care about people. We care about people. You and I, we all care about people and want to make the world a better place. And psychological safety is a wonderful place to start. It has everything to do with social interaction, as we talked about at the very beginning. It dictates the health of our relationships, not just at work, but at home and with friends and with any social collective of which we're a part. And so that to me was just so encouraging to see that type of feedback from our community. So on that note, just a little bit of a plug, an unashamed, unabashed plug for the certification. We do have those 3 certifications left. Those sessions have sold out every time that we've held one since the beginning. And so we would encourage you to engage with us there to get access to some of the additional tools and resources to help your organization or your clients create higher levels of psychological safety. So I think that's about it, Tim. Anything else on your agenda that you wanted to cover before we hop off today?
Not really. Really appreciate the conversation. I'll just say that psychological safety is really about reaching your potential as a human being and helping others. We are biologically driven to connect. We are social creatures, and we need to be able to do that well. The way we interact determines the way that we feel, and it determines the quality of our lives. And so psychological safety is something that we need to care about in every setting. So really appreciate the time and the opportunity to be with everyone today.
Yeah, if you're interested in any of the things that we've mentioned today, the ebook, the certification, some of these resources, they all live at LeaderFactor.com. The certification dates are on the website. There's one in October, one in November, and one in December. I don't know the exact dates and times off the top of my head, but Laurie, you can check out the website. On if we could have the producer of this, Ben, if you'll go ahead and throw that in the chat so people have access to that and you can take a look. And if you have any questions about psychological safety generally, if you have any questions about any of our content, feel free to reach out. We would love to engage with you. Okay. Thank you all. If you've enjoyed this, please leave a like on the stream, and we will connect with you once again in just a few short weeks. All right. Take care, everybody.